Charleston's East Bay Street held a secret that city records tried to bury for over a century. A single cobblestone lane, no more than 40 feet long, connecting two prosperous warehouses near the waterfront. By 1847, locals had stopped using its original name. They called it something else, something whispered, the Street of the Lost Boy. Official maps from the Charleston archive show this alley existed between 1789 and 1852, then vanishes from every subsequent survey. No explanation given, no demolition recorded. The city simply stopped acknowledging it existed. What happened on that narrow passage involved 23 people, a 7-year-old child, and a practice so disturbing that Charleston's elite families paid substantial sums to ensure certain ledgers never saw daylight. The boy's name was recorded only once, in a customs document that disappeared from the South Carolina Historical Society in 1923. Before we continue with the story of this forgotten street and the child who gave it its name, I need you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because stories like this one, stories that were meant to stay hidden, need to be told. And leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know where these forgotten histories are reaching. Now let's talk about what really happened on East Bay Street, and why Charleston spent 160 years pretending it never did. The story begins not with the boy, but with the men who built their fortunes on that street. Charleston in 1847 stood as the wealthiest city in the American South. Its port processed more rice, cotton, and indigo than any harbor below Baltimore. The waterfront stretched for miles, a maze of warehouses, auction houses, and counting rooms where fortunes changed hands daily. East Bay Street ran parallel to the Cooper River, lined with 3-story brick buildings that housed some of the most profitable businesses in the state. Among these establishments, 2 stood prominently: the Vendue House, owned by Harold Gadsden, and the Maritime Storage Company, operated by the Pinckney family. Between these buildings ran a service alley, barely wide enough for 2 men to pass shoulder to shoulder. The alley had no official name on city maps. Workers called it the Back Passage. It connected the rear entrances of both properties and served as a private thoroughfare for moving goods between the warehouses and the docks. Harold Gadsden came from old Charleston money. His grandfather had signed the state constitution. His father owned 17,000 acres of rice plantations in the Low Country. Harold himself preferred the mercantile trade to farming. He'd purchased the Vendue House in 1839, transforming it into one of Charleston's most profitable auction sites. 3 times a week, crowds gathered in his showroom to bid on merchandise arriving from across the Atlantic and the Caribbean. The Pinckney family needed no introduction in Charleston society. Robert Pinckney ran the Maritime Storage Company with his 2 brothers, managing the warehouses that held goods in transit. Cotton bales waiting for shipment to Liverpool, barrels of sugar and molasses from Jamaica, rice from the surrounding plantations, furniture and manufactured goods from northern factories. The Pinckneys charged storage fees, insurance fees, and handling fees. By 1847, their operation generated over $40,000 annually. The 2 businesses shared more than a property line. They shared a system, a method of operation that existed in the shadows of Charleston's legitimate commerce. In the records that survived, this system had no name. In the whispered conversations of the waterfront, it was called special handling. Special handling involved merchandise that required discretion. Items that appeared in no customs log, no shipping manifest, no bill of sale. The Vendue House would receive notice of such merchandise through coded correspondence. The Maritime Storage Company would provide temporary accommodation in its secured spaces. Between the 2 establishments in that narrow alley, the merchandise would move under cover of darkness or heavy rain, when the street traffic diminished and prying eyes stayed indoors. Most of this merchandise consisted of luxury goods that wealthy buyers preferred to purchase without public record. French wines during trade embargoes, British textiles that avoided import duties, Cuban tobacco that bypassed federal taxes. The system worked smoothly for 8 years without incident. Then came the summer of 1847, and everything changed. The catalpa trees along East Bay Street bloomed white that June, their heavy flowers dropping petals across the cobblestones. The heat arrived early and stayed late, turning the air thick enough to chew. Ships crowded the harbor, their masts creating a forest against the sky. Business boomed. Cotton prices had reached their highest point in a decade. Every warehouse in the district operated at capacity. That's when Harold Gadsden received an unusual letter. The correspondence came through a Baltimore intermediary, a man named Parsons, who occasionally facilitated special handling arrangements. The letter itself contained minimal detail. A shipment would arrive in Charleston within the month. It required the utmost discretion. The buyer wished to remain completely anonymous. The merchandise was delicate and required careful management. Payment would be substantial, $500, 10 times the usual fee for special handling. Gadsden consulted with Robert Pinckney. Both men knew that $500 meant serious business and serious risk, but $500 also meant serious profit to be split between them. They agreed to accept the arrangement. The letter provided specific instructions. The merchandise would arrive by land, not by sea. It would come at night, a specific night, July 17th after midnight. The back alley between their properties should be prepared. A secure room in the Maritime Storage Company should be made ready. No workers should be present. Only Gadsden and Pinckney themselves should handle the initial reception. July 17th arrived hot and moonless. Clouds covered the sky, threatening rain that never came. Gadsden and Pinckney waited in the alley, a single lantern between them casting shadows against the brick walls. The air smelled of salt water and horse manure, the usual perfume of the waterfront. Around 2 in the morning they heard the wagon. It came from the north, moving slowly, its wheels creaking on the cobblestones. The driver wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. Beside him sat another man, face obscured by shadow. The wagon itself was enclosed, covered with heavy canvas tied down tight. The wagon stopped at the alley entrance. The driver climbed down without speaking. He moved to the back of the wagon, untied the canvas, and pulled it aside. Inside sat a wooden crate, roughly 4 feet long and 3 feet high. It had rope handles on each end and air holes drilled along the top. Gadsden felt his stomach tighten. He'd handled many kinds of special merchandise, but never anything that required air holes. The driver and his companion lifted the crate from the wagon bed. It was heavy enough to require both men, and as they carried it into the alley, Gadsden heard something shift inside. A slight scraping sound, like fabric dragging against wood. "Where?" the driver asked, his first word. Robert Pinckney pointed toward the Maritime Storage Company's rear entrance. The corner room, 2nd floor. The 2 men carried the crate through the door, up a narrow staircase, and into a small chamber that Pinckney had prepared. The room had a single barred window overlooking the alley, a table, a chair, and an oil lamp. Nothing else. They set the crate down carefully. The driver produced a key from his pocket and handed it to Gadsden. "The buyer arrives in 3 days," the driver said. "Nobody opens this before then. Nobody enters this room. You received your first payment?" Gadsden nodded. $250 had arrived by courier the previous week. The rest comes when the buyer takes delivery. The driver looked at both men carefully. "You don't know what's inside. You never knew what was inside. That's why you're being paid." Then both men left, the wagon rolling away into the darkness. Gadsden and Pinckney stood in the alley, listening as the sound faded. The morning heat was already building, even at this hour. "We should look," Pinckney said quietly. "We shouldn't," Gadsden replied. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Gadsden locked the storage building's rear door and went home. He didn't sleep that night, or the next. Because from that corner room on the 2nd floor of the Maritime Storage Company, starting just before dawn on July 18th, came a sound that would haunt East Bay Street for the next 5 years. Crying. A child's crying. The workers arrived at the Maritime Storage Company at 6 that morning, as they did every morning. Within an hour, 3 separate men mentioned the sound to Robert Pinkney. "Sir, there's a child crying in the corner room." "Mr. Pinkney, sounds like someone's baby is upstairs. That crying's been going on for an hour now. Should someone check?" Pinkney dismissed each inquiry with the same response. A temporary storage situation, a family matter, nothing that concerned them. He ordered the room left alone, and the workers returned to their duties, though the crying continued throughout the day. By afternoon, people walking past the Maritime Storage Company on East Bay Street could hear it, a thin, high sound that seemed to seep through the brick walls. Several passers-by stopped, looking up at the barred window on the second floor, but the window was too high to see through and revealed nothing. The crying would stop for periods, an hour or two of silence, then resume. It had a quality that made people uncomfortable, not the angry crying of a tantrum or the sharp crying of pain, but something worse, a hopeless, exhausted sound. The crying of someone who'd given up on being heard. Harold Gadsden came to the storage company that evening. He and Pinkney stood in the alley, looking up at that barred window. "We can't have this continue," Gadsden said. "People are noticing." "What do you suggest?" Pinkney asked. "We were paid to keep the merchandise secure until the buyer arrives. That's 2 more days." "That's not merchandise in there, Robert. That's a child." "We don't know that. We haven't looked." But they both knew. The crying made it obvious. "Who's the buyer?" Gadsden asked. "I don't know. Parsons arranged everything. The buyer wants complete anonymity." "For what purpose? What does someone need a child for that requires this kind of secrecy?" Pinkney didn't answer. But both men knew that in Charleston in 1847 there were several answers to that question, none of them pleasant. The domestic servant trade operated in a gray area of the law. Children could be purchased for household service, essentially a form of long-term indenture that bordered on outright ownership. The practice wasn't technically legal, but it wasn't technically illegal either, provided the right paperwork existed. Wealthy families who wanted servants that could be trained young, molded to their household's specific requirements, sometimes acquired children through discreet channels. But that transaction normally happened through established networks. Known brokers, documented sales. The level of secrecy surrounding this delivery suggested something else. Something that couldn't risk even minimal documentation. The crying continued through the night. Gadsden lay in his bed 3 blocks away and heard it in his mind, even though the actual sound couldn't carry that far. At 4 in the morning he rose, dressed, and walked through the empty streets to East Bay Street. The city slept around him. Gas lamps flickered at intersections. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The air smelled like low tide, that peculiar marsh smell that Charleston wore like perfume. He let himself into the storage company through the rear door. The building creaked in the darkness, wood and brick settling in the cooling air. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, each step creaking under his weight. He stood outside the corner room's door. From inside came silence now. The crying had stopped. Gadsden had the key in his pocket. He could open the door, open the crate, see what they were really dealing with. But the driver's words echoed in his mind. "You don't know what's inside. You never knew what was inside." He stood there for 10 minutes, hand on the key in his pocket, listening to the silence from the room. Then he heard it, not crying, singing. A child's voice so quiet he could barely make out the words. A song he recognized, one of the spirituals that the enslaved sang in the rice fields. "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows my sorrow." The voice was small and tired, but it carried a strange determination, like the child was singing to stay alive, to prove to himself that he was still there. Gadsden backed away from the door. He descended the stairs and left the building without opening that room. The next day, July 19th, brought more problems. A woman stopped outside the Maritime Storage Company around noon, listening to the crying that had resumed. She asked a worker what was happening. The worker, uncomfortable, claimed ignorance. The woman persisted. She wanted to speak to management about the child she could clearly hear crying inside the building. Robert Pinckney met with her briefly. He explained that a traveling family had temporarily stored some belongings, including a fretful infant. The situation was temporary and under control. The woman looked skeptical but left. However, word was spreading through the neighborhood. Several businesses along East Bay Street had customers mentioning the crying child. People were starting to talk. That evening, Gadsden and Pinckney met again in the alley. "This can't continue," Gadsden said. "We need to contact Parsons and tell the buyer to collect immediately. Tonight, if possible." "The agreed date is tomorrow," Pinckney replied. "If we change the arrangement, we risk the buyer walking away." "That's $250 we'd have to return, plus we'd still have the situation to deal with." "The situation is a child locked in a crate, Robert. We need to end this now." "One more day, 24 hours. The buyer arrives tomorrow night, July 20th. The transaction completes and this ends." Gadsden wanted to argue but couldn't find solid ground. They'd accepted the money. They'd agreed to the terms. Breaking those terms now would mean returning payment they'd already spent and potentially ending their special handling business entirely. Word would spread that they couldn't be trusted to maintain discretion. So they waited. July 20th arrived with thunderstorms. Rain hammered Charleston throughout the afternoon, turning streets into rivers and driving everyone indoors. The Maritime Storage Company's workers left early, eager to get home before the worst of the weather arrived. By 6 o'clock, the building stood empty except for Gadsden and Pinckney. They'd received word that the buyer would arrive at 8. 2 more hours. The crying from the corner room had become intermittent. Long periods of silence broken by brief episodes of weak sobbing. The child's voice sounded different now. Hoarse. Exhausted. "Should we give him water?" Pinckney asked. The question surprised Gadsden. It was the first time either of them had referred to the child directly, acknowledging the reality of what they were doing. "We weren't told to," Gadsden replied. "We weren't told not to." They stood in the hallway outside the corner room, rain drumming against the roof. 3 days had passed since the crate had been delivered. 3 days without anyone opening it, checking on its contents, providing food or water. "The buyer will be here in 2 hours, Gadsden said. "It's done then. Let the buyer handle it." But at 7:30 a messenger arrived. A boy of 12 or 13, soaked from the rain, carrying a sealed letter. Gadsden opened it while the boy waited. The message was brief. "Buyer delayed due to weather. Will arrive July 21st, same time. Continue security protocols." Another day. Another 24 hours. Gadsden gave the messenger a coin and sent him away. Then he and Pinckney stood in the empty building, listening to rain pound the roof and silence come from the corner room. The singing had stopped hours ago. The crying had stopped around noon. Now there was only silence. "We need to check," Pinckney said quietly. Gadsden pulled out the key. They climbed to the second floor and unlocked the corner room. The oil lamp had burned out, so they brought a lantern from downstairs. Its light pushed back the darkness, revealing the wooden crate sitting exactly where it had been placed 3 days earlier. The crate hadn't moved. The rope handles remained in place. The air holes along the top showed as small dark circles. Gadsden knelt beside it and pressed his ear to the wood. He listened for a long moment. "I hear breathing," he said finally. "Shallow, but there." They both exhaled in relief. Whatever was in the crate was still alive. "We should open it," Pinckney said. "Give water at least. And if the buyer considers that a breach of contract, then let him. I won't have a child's death on my hands." Gadsden looked at the crate for a long moment. Then he inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The lock clicked open. He lifted the hasp and pulled up the lid. Inside, curled on his side atop a thin layer of straw, lay a boy of perhaps 7 years old. His skin was dark, though in the lamplight it was hard to determine exact shade. He wore a simple cotton shirt and trousers, both dirty. His feet were bare, his eyes were closed, but his chest moved, breathing, alive. Scattered around him in the crate were a tin cup, now empty, and what looked like the remnants of cornbread reduced to crumbs. Someone had provided minimal supplies, enough to keep him alive for perhaps 2 days. But 3 days had passed. The boy's lips were cracked and dry. His breathing made a slight whistling sound. Pinckney left and returned with a dipper of water. He knelt and lifted the boy's head carefully, bringing the dipper to his lips. The boy's eyes opened, unfocused. He drank weakly, water spilling down his chin. After several sips, his eyes focused on Pinckney's face, then on Gadsden standing behind him. The boy didn't speak. He just looked at them with an expression that Gadsden would remember for the rest of his life. Not fear, not hope, just a kind of empty acknowledgement. Then his eyes closed again, and his head sagged back. They gave him more water, a bit of bread that Pinckney had in his pocket. The boy ate mechanically without real awareness. When he'd finished, they lowered him back into the crate and closed the lid. Neither man spoke as they left the room and locked the door. They waited in the main warehouse office, listening to rain batter the windows. Around midnight, they both left for their homes, agreeing to return in the morning before the workers arrived. But when Gadsden reached his house on Trad Street, he couldn't enter. He stood on his own doorstep in the rain, key in hand, unable to turn the lock. Inside waited his wife, his 3 daughters, his comfortable life built on rice profits and mercantile success. And 3 blocks away, a 7-year-old boy lay locked in a wooden crate, waiting to be sold to someone who required such extraordinary secrecy that they'd paid $500 to ensure no record of the transaction would exist. Gadsden walked through the rain back to East Bay Street. He let himself into the storage company, climbed to the 2nd floor, and sat in the hallway outside the corner room. He sat there until dawn, listening to the rain and the silence from behind the door, trying to understand how a successful Charleston merchant had become a jailer of children. When light began filtering through the warehouse windows, he heard something from the corner room. Not crying, not singing, scratching. The boy was scratching at the inside of the crate. Slow, rhythmic scratching, the sound of fingernails dragging across wood. Scratch, scratch, scratch. That sound would haunt East Bay Street for years to come. Robert Pinckney arrived at 7 that morning and found Gadsden still sitting in the hallway. "Did you sleep?" Pinckney asked. "No." "Neither did I." They sat together in silence while workers arrived and began the day's business. The scratching from the corner room had stopped around dawn. Now came only occasional sounds of movement. The boy was awake, but quiet. At 10 o'clock, a messenger arrived with another letter. Gadsden opened it with hands that shook slightly from exhaustion. "Buyer delayed again. Will arrive July 22nd. Maintain current arrangements. Additional compensation of $100 for inconvenience. July 22nd. 2 more days." Gadsden crumpled the letter. "No." "What?" "No. This ends now. We return the money, we contact Parsons, and we end this arrangement. Harold, think clearly. We're talking about $350 already received, plus 100 more promised. That's nearly a year's profit from special handling. I don't care about the profit anymore. There's a child locked in a crate up there. We're being paid to keep him imprisoned while some anonymous buyer takes their time deciding when to collect. We don't know what the buyer intends. Don't we?" Gadsden's voice rose. "Someone who pays $500 to ensure a transaction leaves no record. Someone who requires this level of secrecy. What possible legitimate purpose could they have?" Pinckney had no answer. Around noon, something changed. The workers reported hearing voices from the corner room. Not crying, but talking. The boy was speaking to himself. One worker, a man named Samuel, who'd been with the company for 15 years, came to Pinckney's office specifically to report it. "Sir, that child up there is talking. I stood outside the door and listened. He's telling himself stories, making up tales about being outside, about running through fields, about his mama. Sir, it's not right what's happening up there." Pinckney dismissed Samuel, but the worker's words stuck. The boy was telling himself stories to survive. That afternoon, a city constable stopped by the Maritime Storage Company, not in official capacity, he explained. He'd simply heard reports of a child crying in the building and wanted to verify everything was acceptable. Pinckney put on his most assured manner. A temporary domestic situation. A traveling family's child who was ill and crying from fever. The family would be collecting the child shortly. Everything was under control. The constable seemed satisfied and left. But his visit shook both Gadsden and Pinckney. Official attention was being drawn to the building. If another complaint came in, the constable might return with actual authority to investigate. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Charleston intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. That evening, Gadsden and Pinckney opened the crate again. They gave the boy water and some chicken and bread from a nearby ordinary. The boy ate silently, his eyes moving between their faces but never focusing directly on either of them. "What's your name?" Gadsden asked. The boy didn't answer. He just chewed mechanically, swallowed, and took another bite. "Where are you from?" Pinckney tried. Nothing. The boy finished eating and drinking, then lay back down in the crate without speaking. His eyes closed. They locked the crate again, locked the room, and left the building. July 21st passed in tense waiting. No messenger arrived, no word from the buyer. The workers continued reporting strange sounds from the corner room. The boy had stopped talking to himself and returned to intermittent crying, though weaker than before. Around 4 in the afternoon, something new happened. A woman appeared at the Maritime Storage Company's front door, asking to speak with management. She introduced herself as Rebecca Howland, member of the Charleston Ladies Protestant Orphan Society. "We've received reports," she told Pinckney, "that a child is being held in this building against their will. I'm here to investigate these claims on behalf of concerned citizens." Pinckney maintained his story about the traveling family and temporary illness. Mrs. Howland listened politely, then produced a letter signed by 3 prominent Charleston ministers requesting access to verify the child's welfare. Pinckney refused. "Private property," he explained. "Private business matter. No authorization for external investigation." Mrs. Howland left, but her parting words chilled both men. "I will be consulting with the city magistrate about this matter. If a child is being mistreated within these walls, Mr. Pinckney, the law will intervene." After she left, Gadsden and Pinckney met in the alley between their buildings. The same alley where the crate had been delivered 4 days earlier. "This is collapsing," Gadsden said. "We need to contact Parsons immediately. Tell the buyer to collect tonight, or we're opening the crate and releasing the boy." "And saying what?" "That we found him wandering. That he appeared mysteriously." "Harold, think about what you're proposing. We've held this child for 4 days. If we release him now, questions will be asked. Our involvement will be investigated. Our entire operation will be exposed. Better that than whatever's coming next." But before they could decide, a messenger arrived at 6 o'clock with a new letter. "Buyer will arrive July 22nd at midnight. Final arrangement. Payment of remaining $250 plus $100 bonus will be delivered upon completion." Midnight tomorrow. One more day. They went home, both men feeling the weight of their situation. They'd entered into this arrangement thinking it was just another special handling job. Instead, they'd become part of something that had turned into imprisonment of a child, with growing public attention and potential legal consequences. That night, neither man slept. Gadsden paced his house while his wife asked what troubled him. He couldn't explain. "How do you tell your family that you've been keeping a child locked in a wooden crate for money?" Around 3 in the morning, Gadsden dressed and walked to East Bay Street. He let himself into the storage company and climbed to the 2nd floor, sat in the hallway outside the corner room. From inside came soft crying again, weak, hopeless crying. Gadsden pulled out the key, unlocked the room, opened the crate, The boy lay curled on his side, tears tracking down his face. His eyes opened and looked at Gadsden without expression. "I'm sorry," Gadsden said quietly. "I'm so sorry." The boy didn't respond. He just looked at Gadsden with those empty eyes. Gadsden gave him water, more bread. The boy ate mechanically. Then Gadsden did something he hadn't planned to do. He lifted the boy out of the crate. The child was light, far too light for a 7-year-old. 4 days with minimal food had taken their toll. Gadsden set him on his feet and the boy stood shakily, holding the edge of the crate for balance. "Can you walk?" Gadsden asked. The boy took a tentative step, then another. His legs shook but held. Gadsden watched him move slowly around the small room. The boy stopped at the barred window and looked out at the darkness. The alley below, the shapes of buildings, the small slice of sky visible between brick walls. They stood there together in silence for perhaps 10 minutes. Then the boy turned and walked back to the crate. He climbed in without being told, lay down on his side, and closed his eyes. Gadsden locked the crate, locked the room, and left. He sat in the warehouse office until dawn, turning over his options. He could release the boy and face the consequences. He could refuse to complete the transaction when the buyer arrived. He could report the entire situation to the city authorities. But each option led to exposure of the special handling operation, to questions about other transactions, to potential prosecution, to the destruction of everything he and Pinckney had built. So he did nothing. July 22nd dawned hot and clear. The workers arrived at 6. Business proceeded normally in the warehouse below, while upstairs, in that corner room, a child waited in a locked crate. Mrs. Howland returned at 9 o'clock with a city magistrate. They demanded access to the building to investigate claims of child mistreatment. Pinckney, prepared now, produced documentation he'd forged overnight. A letter from a fictional family claiming custody of their son who was ill with scarlet fever and being isolated for public safety. A medical note from a real doctor who Pinckney had paid $20 to sign without asking questions. The magistrate examined the documents, listened to Pinckney's explanations, and concluded that while the situation was unusual, it didn't warrant official intervention. He warned Pinckney that if any actual evidence of mistreatment emerged, there would be serious legal consequences. After they left, Gadsden found Pinckney in his office. "That won't hold for long," Gadsden said. "Someone will investigate more thoroughly. Someone will demand to actually see the child. It only needs to hold until midnight. Then this ends." They waited through the day. Workers reported that the crying from the corner room had stopped entirely around noon. Now came only silence. At 5 o'clock, Gadsden went to check. He opened the crate and found the boy lying motionless. For a terrible moment he thought the child had died. Then he saw the shallow breathing. The boy's eyes were open but unfocused. His lips were cracked and bleeding slightly. His breathing rattled in his chest. Gadsden gave him water, but the boy barely swallowed. He tried to get him to eat, but the boy couldn't chew. "We need a doctor," Gadsden said when Pinckney arrived. "We can't bring a doctor here. Not now, not with hours to go. Robert, this child might die before midnight. Then that's on the buyer for their delays. We've done what was required." Gadsden stared at his partner. In that moment, he saw clearly what they'd become. Men who could watch a child die rather than risk their business interests. He left the building without another word and walked through Charleston's streets as evening fell. The city moved around him, beautiful and alive. Families heading to dinner, children playing in gardens, church bells ringing the hour. 3 blocks away, a boy was dying in a wooden crate. At 11 o'clock, Gadsden returned to the Maritime Storage Company. Pinckney was waiting in the main office. Neither spoke. They waited as the clock moved toward midnight. The wagon arrived at exactly 12:07 on the morning of July 23rd. Same enclosed design, same canvas covering, same 2 men in front. But this time a third man sat in the back, visible when the canvas was pulled aside. This man wore expensive clothes, a fine coat despite the summer heat, a tall hat, white gloves. His face remained shadowed in the darkness. but his voice carried the cultured accent of Charleston's elite class. He stepped down from the wagon carefully, as if concerned about soiling his shoes on the cobblestones. He took a moment to survey the alley, his eyes moving across the brick walls, the barred window above, the locked door of the storage company. "Gentlemen," he said to Gadsden and Pinckney, "I apologize for the delays. Circumstances required caution. You've been compensated for the inconvenience." "We've been told compensation is coming," Pinckney replied, his voice tight. The gentleman reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "The remaining $250 as agreed, plus 100 additional. You've maintained complete discretion?" "Yes," Gadsden said. "But there have been complications. A magistrate investigated. Questions have been asked. People have heard." "What people have heard," the gentleman interrupted smoothly, "is entirely your concern, not mine. My only interest is whether our arrangement remains confidential. Has anyone connected this transaction to me specifically?" "We don't even know who you are," Pinckney said. "Precisely, and that shall remain the case." The gentleman adjusted his gloves. "Now I understand the merchandise has experienced some distress during the extended wait. This is regrettable but not unexpected given the circumstances." Gadsden felt anger rising in his chest. "The boy has been locked in a crate for 5 days. His condition has deteriorated significantly. He's barely conscious. He needs medical attention." The gentleman's expression didn't change. "The boy will receive whatever attention I deem appropriate once the transaction is complete." "Where is he now?" "Upstairs. Corner room. But I need to tell you something, Mr. Gadsden." The gentleman's voice remained calm, but carried an edge now. "I entered into this arrangement with clear terms. You agreed to those terms for substantial payment. The delays were unfortunate but necessary. Your compensation has been adjusted accordingly. What I do not require is your commentary on the merchandise's condition or your assessment of what it needs. I require you to fulfill your contractual obligation. Now please retrieve what I've purchased." The two wagon men had moved to positions flanking the gentleman. Neither spoke, but their presence created an implied threat that needed no words. Gadsden and Pinckney exchanged glances. Then they turned and entered the storage company, climbing the stairs in silence. The building felt different at midnight. The familiar creaks and settling sounds seemed amplified in the darkness. Their lamplight cast long shadows on the walls. They reached the corner room and Gadsden unlocked the door. The room still smelled of confinement, of human suffering compressed into a small space. Pinckney unlocked the crate while Gadsden held the lamp. The lock clicked open. The lid lifted. The boy lay curled on his side, eyes half open but unfocused. His breathing made a wet, rattling sound. When Gadsden reached in to lift him, the child's skin felt hot to the touch. Fever had set in. "He's burning up," Gadsden said quietly. "I know." They lifted the boy as gently as possible. He weighed almost nothing, his body limp in their arms, his head lolled against Gadsden's shoulder. As they carried him toward the door, the boy's eyes opened slightly wider. For just a moment, he seemed to focus on Gadsden's face. His cracked lips moved, but no sound came out. "What is it?" Gadsden whispered. The boy's lips moved again. This time Gadsden heard it. A single word, so quiet, it was almost nothing. "Mama." Then his eyes closed again and his head sagged back. They carried him downstairs and into the alley. The gentleman waited, standing in a shaft of moonlight that had broken through the clouds. Behind him, the wagon sat with its canvas cover pulled back, revealing the empty bed. The gentleman examined the boy by lamplight, his face showing no emotion. He lifted the child's chin with one gloved hand, checked his eyes by pulling back the lids, examined his teeth, his hands, his arms. "You said he was 7?" the gentleman asked. "That was our understanding," Pinckney replied. "He's small for 7, malnourished before you received him, I'd wager. The fever is unfortunate but manageable. How long since he's had water?" "We gave him water this evening," Gadsden said, "around 7 o'clock. "And food?" "He couldn't eat. He tried but couldn't swallow properly." The gentleman nodded slowly, still examining the boy with the detached interest of someone inspecting a horse at auction. The respiratory distress is concerning. Did he have this rattling before tonight? It started yesterday afternoon. I see. The gentleman released the boy's chin and stepped back. Well, he'll receive proper attention soon enough. I have arrangements in place. He gestured to the two wagon men. They moved forward, and one of them produced a large canvas bag from the wagon bed. It was the kind used for mail or grain. Heavy canvas with a drawstring top. They opened it and began to place the boy inside, feet first. "Wait," Gadsden said. "What are you doing?" "Continuing our discreet transportation," the gentleman replied calmly. "Surely you didn't expect me to parade him through Charleston streets in his current condition. That would raise questions neither of us want asked. He can't breathe properly already. Putting him in that bag will suffocate him. The journey is short, Mr. Gadsden, less than a mile. The bag has adequate ventilation." The gentleman gestured to small holes punched in the canvas. "You see? I've taken appropriate precautions." The wagon men continued placing the boy in the bag. The child's body folded into the canvas sack, his knees drawn up, his head tilted at an angle. They pulled the drawstring, leaving only a small opening at the top. The bag moved slightly. The boy was trying to shift position inside it, attempting to find a way to breathe more easily. Something inside Gadsden broke. 5 days of complicity, of choosing profit over principle, of watching a child suffer while telling himself it wasn't his responsibility, all of it crystallized in that moment into a clarity he couldn't ignore. "No," he said. "No, this ends now." The gentleman turned to him slowly. "Excuse me? You're not taking him like this. If you want him, you transport him properly, openly, or you don't take him at all." The alley went very quiet. Even the distant sounds of the city seemed to fade. "Mr. Gadsden," the gentleman said, his voice still calm but carrying a new coldness. "I believe you're forgetting our arrangement. I've paid you $450 for a specific service. You have accepted that payment. You will now provide that service. The arrangement is over. You're 3 days late. The boy is in critical condition because of those delays. I'm ending this transaction. Take your money back." Gadsden pulled the envelope from his pocket and held it out. "Here, take it and leave. We'll care for the boy and find his family." The gentleman didn't take the envelope. He simply looked at Gadsden with eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. "You'll care for the boy?" he asked quietly. "You, who've kept him locked in a wooden crate for 5 days. You, who've watched him deteriorate without summoning medical help. You, who've accepted significant payment to facilitate his transfer. You believe you have moral authority here? I don't claim moral authority. I'm claiming basic human decency, something I should have claimed 5 days ago. How admirable. A sudden attack of conscience." The gentleman's voice dripped with contempt. "Tell me, Mr. Gadsden, when exactly did this conscience emerge? When you first locked him in that crate? When you heard him crying for 3 days straight? When you fed him barely enough to keep him alive? Or just now, when you realized you might face consequences?" Gadsden had no answer. The gentleman's words cut because they were true. "I thought not." The gentleman adjusted his gloves again. "Let me make something very clear to both of you. This transaction will complete as agreed. You will receive your payment. The merchandise will transfer to my custody. And you will both return to your lives with no further involvement. Those are the only acceptable outcomes of this evening." "And if we refuse?" Pinckney asked quietly. He'd been silent until now, but something in the gentleman's tone had triggered his own resistance. "If you refuse," the gentleman said, still in that calm, cold voice, "then I'll be forced to pursue alternative methods of resolution. Methods that would be unfortunate for everyone involved." What happened next occurred in seconds, but felt like hours. The gentleman made a slight gesture with his hand, barely a movement at all. One of the wagon men reached into his coat and pulled out a pistol, a percussion cap revolver, expensive and well-maintained. He held it loosely at his side, not quite pointing it at anyone, but making its presence unmistakably clear. "I don't make threats lightly, gentlemen," the gentleman said, "nor do I make them often. But I will make them when necessary to protect my interests and my privacy. You've been well compensated for your services. You will complete those services. The alternative is that certain information about your special handling business becomes known to Charleston authorities, information that would be quite damaging, I imagine." Gadsden felt his blood run cold. "You've been investigating us? I make it my business to know who I'm conducting business with. Your special handling operation has been quite profitable over the years, hasn't it? Luxury goods avoiding import duties, British textiles during trade restrictions, Cuban tobacco bypassing federal taxes, all sorts of interesting merchandise moving through that alley between your buildings. I wonder what the customs office would make of detailed records covering 8 years of such transactions." "You're bluffing," Pinckney said, but his voice wavered. "Am I? Would you like to test that theory? Because I'm quite prepared to send those records to the appropriate authorities tomorrow morning if this transaction doesn't complete satisfactorily tonight." The silence stretched. Gadsden looked at the canvas bag containing the boy. It had stopped moving. Either the child had found a position where he could breathe, or he'd lost consciousness. "There's another option," Gadsden said slowly. "We complete the transaction. You take the boy, but you tell us where you're taking him. You give us some assurance that he'll receive proper care." The gentleman smiled, but it held no humor. "You want assurance? Very well. I assure you that the boy will receive exactly the care I deem appropriate for my purposes. Will that suffice?" "What purposes?" Pinckney asked. "What do you want him for?" "That, Mr. Pinckney, is entirely none of your concern. You were hired to facilitate a transfer, not to question the buyer's intentions. Now, are we going to complete this transaction, or shall I make some unfortunate correspondence in the morning?" Gadsden looked at Pinckney. His partner's face had gone pale. They both knew they had no real choice. The gentleman held all the leverage. Their special handling business, if exposed, would mean prosecution, imprisonment, financial ruin. Their families would be destroyed. "One condition," Gadsden said quietly. "We open the bag before you leave. We verify he's still breathing." The gentleman considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Acceptable, provided you do so quickly." One of the wagon men loosened the drawstring and pulled open the top of the canvas bag. Inside, the boy lay motionless, his face visible in the lamplight. His eyes were closed. His chest moved barely, with shallow breaths. But he was alive. The wagon man closed the bag again and lifted it. The gentleman himself took it from him, surprisingly strong despite his refined appearance. He carried the bag to the wagon and placed it carefully in the bed, positioning it so the ventilation holes aligned with the gaps in the wooden slats. Then he turned back to Gadsden and Pinckney. "Get back inside," he said quietly. "Both of you. Close the door. Wait 10 minutes before emerging. If you come out sooner, or if you speak about this evening to anyone, ever, there will be consequences. Consequences that extend beyond legal troubles. Do I make myself absolutely clear?" Gadsden looked at the pistol still visible in the wagon man's hand. He looked at the gentleman's cold eyes. He looked at the canvas bag in the wagon bed, now completely still. "Do I make myself clear?" The gentleman repeated. "Yes," Gadsden whispered. "Mr. Pinckney?" "Yes," Pinckney said, his voice barely audible. "Excellent. This transaction is now complete. You've fulfilled your obligation. I've fulfilled mine. Our business is concluded. Neither of us shall speak of it again." The gentleman climbed into the wagon bed and sat beside the canvas bag. He placed one gloved hand on it, possessive. Then he looked down at Gadsden and Pinckney one final time. "Gentlemen, I suggest you carefully consider how you conduct your special handling business going forward. The world is changing. The things we could do quietly 10 years ago are becoming harder to conceal. Eventually, Charleston's shadows won't be deep enough to hide everything. Remember that." He gestured to the driver. The wagon man with the pistol climbed into the front seat, while the other moved to the rear. The driver snapped the reins. The wagon rolled forward slowly, its wheels creaking on the cobblestones. It moved down the alley toward East Bay Street, the canvas bag visible in the back until darkness swallowed it completely. Gadsden and Pinckney stood frozen, watching it disappear. The sound of the wheels faded. Then came only the night sounds of Charleston. Distant voices, a dog barking, the lapping of water against the docks. They stood there for exactly 10 minutes, neither speaking. When the time had passed, they emerged into the alley. Nothing remained but wheel tracks in the dust and the envelope of money sitting on a crate near the door, where Gadsden had dropped it during the confrontation. Pinckney picked up the envelope and opened it. He counted the money in the lamplight, $350, all there. Blood money, Gadsden said quietly. It's just money, Pinckney replied. But his hands shook as he divided it into 2 stacks. They stood in the alley between their buildings, the same alley where 6 days earlier a wooden crate had been delivered, the same alley where they'd heard a child crying, singing, scratching at wood, the same alley where they'd made a choice to value profit over principle. What have we done? Gadsden asked. Pinckney had no answer. They never saw the boy again. The wagon, the gentleman, the child, all vanished into Charleston's night and left no trace in any official record. But the effects of that July night rippled outward in ways neither man anticipated. The next morning, Gadsden and Pinckney met in the alley between their buildings at dawn, before any workers arrived. They spoke in whispers, though no one was there to overhear. We can't continue the special handling business, Gadsden said. Not after this. I know. We have to dismantle it completely. No more discrete transactions. Nothing that can connect us to what happened. Pinckney nodded slowly. I've already burned the correspondence from Parsons, all of it. Every letter, every coded message, every record of special handling over the past 8 years. The ashes are at the bottom of the harbor. The money? Divided it last night after you left. $350 each. Pinckney's voice was flat, emotionless. Our share for watching a child slowly die over 5 days. They stood in silence. The morning heat was already building, turning the air thick. In a few hours, workers would arrive and business would continue as if nothing had happened, as if the corner room on the second floor hadn't held a boy in a crate, as if an alley between 2 respectable businesses hadn't been the site of a transaction no one wanted to acknowledge. What do we tell people? Pinckney asked. About the crying, about the magistrate's investigation, about Mrs. Howland's concerns. People will ask. We tell them the family collected their sick child, that he recovered from his fever, and they continued their travels, that everything resolved appropriately. And if someone investigates further, if Mrs. Howland doesn't accept that answer, Gadsden met his partner's eyes. There's nothing to investigate. No records, no witnesses except us, no family to claim him. The boy himself has disappeared completely into whatever fate that gentleman planned. Without evidence, there's nothing anyone can pursue. What if the gentleman talks? What if someone traces the transaction back to us? He won't. He paid too much for secrecy to throw it away. His anonymity protects us as much as it protects him. And that's exactly what happened, at least initially. Mrs. Rebecca Howland returned on July 24th, the day after the transaction. She arrived at the Maritime Storage Company at 10 in the morning with 2 other women from the Charleston Ladies Protestant Orphan Society. They demanded to see the child immediately. Pinckney met them in his office, composed and ready. He explained that the family had collected their son late the previous night. The boy's fever had broken, and they decided to continue their journey while he was strong enough to travel. Everything had resolved satisfactorily. Mrs. Howland demanded proof. Pinckney showed her the corner room, now empty and swept clean. He produced the forged letter from the fictional family, thanking him for his accommodation during their son's illness. He maintained his story with absolute consistency. I want to speak with this family, Mrs. Howland said. They've already left Charleston. They were traveling north to Richmond, if I recall correctly. but I didn't inquire too deeply into their plans. What was their name? Pinckney had prepared for this. Patterson, David and Eleanor Patterson, with their son Thomas. The father was a merchant dealing in tobacco. Mrs. Howland wrote this down, though they both knew she'd find no record of any Patterson family matching that description. The name was common enough to be plausible, generic enough to be untraceable. "If I discover you've been lying to me, Mr. Pinckney," she said quietly, "I will ensure the authorities investigate this matter thoroughly. I assure you, madam, everything I've told you is the truth." She left, but her suspicion remained palpable. She returned again on July 27th, and again on August 2nd, each time asking more questions, probing for inconsistencies in the story. Pinckney held firm. The Patterson family had collected their sick son. Everything was resolved. By mid-August, Mrs. Howland's visits stopped. Without evidence, without witnesses, without any concrete proof that something improper had occurred, her investigation couldn't proceed. The story of the sick child and the traveling family became the official explanation, thin as it was. But the workers at the Maritime Storage Company hadn't forgotten. They'd heard the crying for days. They'd witnessed the magistrate's investigation, Mrs. Howland's persistent visits, the sudden resolution that satisfied no one. They talked among themselves in quiet conversations during lunch breaks and slow afternoons. Samuel, the worker who'd reported hearing the boy talking to himself, approached Pinckney in September with a question. "Sir, about that child from July, the one who was sick in the corner room." "Yes? What about him?" "I was just wondering if you ever heard from the family after they left. If the boy recovered fully." Pinckney looked at Samuel carefully. "Why do you ask?" "No particular reason, sir. Just concern for the child. He sounded so distressed those days he was here. The family sent word that he recovered completely. They were very grateful for our accommodation during his illness." Samuel nodded slowly, but his eyes held doubt. "That's good to hear, sir. That's very good to hear." He returned to his work, but the conversation left Pinckney unsettled. The workers knew something was wrong. They might not know what exactly, but they knew the official story didn't match what they'd witnessed. By October, something else began to happen. Workers started avoiding the corner room. When storage assignments required its use, men would volunteer for other locations instead. Those who did use it reported an uncomfortable feeling, a sense of unease they couldn't articulate. "It just feels wrong in there," one worker told Pinckney, "like something bad happened." Pinckney stopped assigning the room for storage. It sat empty and locked, a small chamber on the second floor that everyone quietly agreed to pretend didn't exist. The alley between the two buildings developed a similar reputation. Workers began to avoid it after dark. Delivery men who'd used it regularly for years started using the front entrances instead, even when it meant longer walks with heavier loads. When asked why, they offered vague explanations. The alley felt oppressive. It made them uncomfortable. Some claimed to hear soft sounds late at night, crying or singing, though no source could be identified. By December 1847, locals in the neighborhood had started using a new name for the alley. Not the back passage as it had been called for years, but something else. Something whispered. The Street of the Lost Boy. Nobody knew exactly who started using the name or why. It simply appeared in casual conversation, in directions given to visitors, in the casual geography of people who lived and worked near East Bay Street. Take the Street of the Lost Boy to reach the waterfront. The delivery entrance is just off the Street of the Lost Boy. Don't walk through the Street of the Lost Boy after dark. The name spread like fog, creeping through conversations until it became common usage. By early 1848, even people who didn't know the alley's history were calling it by that name. City officials noticed. In March 1848, a city clerk noted in his records that an unnamed alley between properties on East Bay Street had acquired an unfortunate informal designation that reflected poorly on the neighborhood. He recommended the city formally name the alley to override the local usage. But before any official action could be taken, other events intervened. Harold Gadsden stopped coming to the Vendew house in January 1848. His employees noticed his absence first. Meetings missed, decisions delayed, important auctions managed by subordinates. When questioned, Gadsden claimed illness. "A persistent fever," he said. "Nothing serious, just requiring rest." But his wife knew different. Gadsden had developed severe insomnia. He would lie in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, then rise in the middle of the night and walk through their house. Sometimes she found him standing at windows, looking out into darkness. Sometimes he sat in his study with no lamp lit, just sitting in the dark. When she asked what troubled him, he couldn't explain, or wouldn't. "I keep hearing something," he told her once, late at night when exhaustion had loosened his tongue. "A sound I can't locate, like crying, but distant, like it's coming from far away and very close at the same time." She heard nothing. Nobody heard anything except Gadsden. By March, he'd stopped going to the Vendew house entirely. He claimed he was selling the business, that he'd received a lucrative offer and decided to accept it. The truth was simpler. He couldn't walk past the Maritime Storage Company anymore. Couldn't look at that alley. Couldn't pass the place where a wagon had rolled away into darkness, carrying a canvas bag that had stopped moving. He sold the Vendew house in April 1848 for less than its value, eager to complete the transaction quickly. In June, he moved his family to Columbia, claiming better opportunities in the state capital. They left Charleston on a humid morning when the catalpas were blooming white again, exactly 1 year after the wooden crate had been delivered. Gadsden never returned to Charleston. According to letters his wife wrote to friends and family, letters preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society's archives, he never slept properly again. He would wake in the night claiming to hear crying, would insist someone was singing despite the silence, would sometimes speak to empty air, as if apologizing to someone no one else could see. His business ventures in Columbia never succeeded. He died in 1856 at the age of 46, the death certificate listing general debility and nervous exhaustion as the cause. He was buried in Columbia, far from Charleston, far from East Bay Street, far from the alley between two warehouses where he'd made a choice that haunted him for the rest of his life. Robert Pinckney continued operating the Maritime Storage Company, but something had changed in him too. His brothers noticed it first. A new rigidity in his business practices, a refusal to engage in anything that wasn't completely documented and legal. The special handling business ended completely. When old clients inquired about discreet services, Pinckney turned them away without explanation. He began attending church services more regularly, started making donations to charitable causes, particularly organizations that help children. In 1850, he made a significant anonymous donation to the Charleston Orphan House, enough to fund the care of 5 children for a full year. His personal papers, donated to the Charleston Museum in 1923, contain an interesting entry from his diary dated December 1849. "I cannot undo what was done. I cannot bring back what was lost. I can only try to balance accounts that can never truly balance. God help me, I try. But the crying continues in my memory, and I wonder if it will ever stop." The corner room where the boy had been held was never used again. Pinckney kept it locked permanently. When the building was eventually sold in 1869, 2 years after Pinckney's death from pneumonia, the new owners found the room empty except for a wooden crate with rope handles and air holes drilled along the top. They burned the crate in the alley. Nobody asked why it was there or what it had been used for. By 1869, the events of 1847 had faded into vague legend, and nobody wanted to resurrect old questions. The alley itself continued to carry its reputation. The Street of the Lost Boy remained in local usage, despite the city's attempts to override it. In 1852, when Charleston conducted a comprehensive survey of its streets for new official maps, the surveyor included a telling note in his records: Alley between properties 147 and 151 East Bay Street, locally called Street of the Lost Boy. Origin of name unknown, strong negative associations in local perception. Recommend removal from official documentation due to impact on property values and neighborhood reputation. The recommendation was accepted. When the new official maps were published in 1853, the alley existed physically, but had disappeared from all city records. It became a nameless passage between two buildings, acknowledged in reality but erased from official recognition. As for the boy himself, no record of his identity ever surfaced. The customs document that allegedly contained his name disappeared from the South Carolina Historical Society's archives sometime before 1923. The loss inventory simply notes, "Unknown document regarding minor child, circa 1847. Missing presumed misfiled." Whether it was stolen, accidentally lost, or deliberately removed remains unknown. The Baltimore intermediary named Parsons left no trace in historical records. His name appeared in no business directories, no shipping manifests, no legal documents from the period. He existed only in burned correspondence and fading memories. The gentleman who collected the boy in the early morning of July 23, 1847, was never identified. His description, expensive clothes, cultured accent, refined manner, fit hundreds of Charleston's wealthy residents. No investigation was ever launched because officially nothing criminal had occurred. No missing person report. No family seeking a lost child. No legal complaint. Just whispered rumors and a nickname for an alley that most people eventually forgot the origin of. The canvas bag, the wagon, the two men who drove it, all disappeared as completely as the boy himself. Whatever fate awaited him after that July night remained unknown. Whether he survived, where he was taken, what purpose the gentleman had for him, all of it vanished into Charleston's shadow economy and left no answer. In the decades that followed, the alley between what had been the Vendu House and the Maritime Storage Company acquired layers of legend. Each generation added new stories, new explanations for why it was called the Street of the Lost Boy. Some claimed a child had died there during the yellow fever epidemic of 1849. Others insisted a boy had been murdered during a robbery in the 1850s. A few remembered something about a kidnapping, though the specifics were always unclear. The actual events of July 1847, the 5 days a 7-year-old boy spent locked in a wooden crate, the transaction that sold him to an anonymous buyer for purposes that remain unknown, the two merchants who chose profit over principle, all of this faded into whispered rumor and then into silence. The people who knew what really happened either died or, like Gadsden and Pinckney, took their knowledge to the grave. The workers who'd heard the crying moved on to other jobs, other cities. Mrs. Howland continued her charitable work until her death in 1871. But her investigation into the Maritime Storage Company incident remained forever incomplete. The alley itself was finally demolished in 1891 during Charleston's harbor expansion project. The warehouses on either side were torn down to make room for modern shipping facilities. The cobblestones were pulled up, revealing nothing but packed earth underneath. The brick walls came down stone by stone. Every physical trace of the Street of the Lost Boy disappeared. But stories have a way of surviving when physical evidence doesn't. Even now, some older Charleston residents remember their grandparents speaking about an alley near East Bay Street where something terrible happened long ago. The details are gone, but the sense of unease remains. On quiet summer nights, particularly in late July when the air turns thick and the catalpas bloom white, some people who walk along East Bay Street claim to hear something carried on the wind. A sound like distant crying, or soft singing, the voice of a child who was never identified, never claimed, never mourned. A boy who disappeared into Charleston's shadow economy in the summer of 1847 and left behind only a nickname for an alley that no longer exists, and a story that no one wanted to remember, but no one could completely forget. This mystery shows us how easily a person can vanish when money, power, and secrecy align against them. How a child can spend 5 days crying in the heart of a busy city, heard by dozens of people, yet still disappear without anyone stopping it. How 2 successful merchants can convince themselves they're just conducting business while participating in something horrific. How guilt can haunt a man for the rest of his life, manifesting in insomnia and phantom sounds that only he can hear. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there darker secrets still buried in Charleston's past? What really happened to that boy after he was carried away in a canvas bag? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. Until the next story.